It's a quiet Wednesday morning on the outskirts of Hillsborough, a small town where mornings are usually uneventful. The roads are empty, lined with rows of modest homes and trimmed lawns. A pale sunrise casts a golden hue over the asphalt, reflecting off dew-soaked car windows. For Officer Brandon Hughes, it's just another shift. Brandon has worked these streets for over a decade. He knows them like the back of his hand, every shortcut, every side alley, every spot where locals are likely to bend the rules just a little. This morning feels no different. He checks his onboard computer for pending calls, glances at the speedometer, and sets his sights on the main road leading out of town. Meanwhile, about 10 miles away, someone else is also beginning their day. Jason Matthews, a special agent with the FBI, is heading to an early meeting downtown. Dressed in casual clothes and driving an unmarked car, he's blending in with the morning commuters. To anyone watching, he's just another guy in a silver sedan. Their paths are about to cross in a way neither could have anticipated. As Officer Hughes makes a right turn onto Maple Drive, he notices a car in the distance, Jason's silver sedan. It's moving just a bit slower than the posted speed limit. Something about it catches his attention. Hughes watches as the car approaches a stop sign. He squints, leaning forward slightly. The license plate is out of state. That's not unusual in a town like Hillsborough, but it's enough to pique his curiosity. He decides to follow the vehicle, maintaining a steady distance. Inside the silver sedan, Jason is completely unaware of the attention he's drawn. His focus is on the road ahead, his mind already on the details of his meeting. As the patrol car closes in, he glances briefly in the rearview mirror but doesn't think much of it. Officer Hughes radios into dispatch, reporting a routine check. "Dispatch, this is 405. I'm running a plate on a suspicious vehicle, out-of-state tags, Maple Drive heading northbound." He types the plate number into his onboard computer and waits. A beat passes. Then another. Dispatch responds, "No flags on the vehicle, all clear." But Hughes isn't ready to let it go. He flips on his lights. The patrol car speeds up, and the sound of sirens pierces the morning calm. Jason glances at the rearview mirror again, this time with more urgency. His pulse quickens, but his training keeps him calm. He pulls over to the side of the road, stopping beneath the shade of a tall oak tree. Hughes steps out of his car, his boots crunching against the gravel shoulder. His posture is firm, his hand resting near his holstered weapon. He approaches the sedan cautiously, scanning the interior as he nears the driver's side window. Jason rolls it down, his FBI badge resting prominently on the dashboard. The two men lock eyes for the first time. What happens next will leave both men questioning everything they thought they knew about their roles, their assumptions, and the world around them. This isn't just another routine traffic stop, it's the beginning of a story that will resonate far beyond this quiet suburban street. Before we dive deeper into this story, don't forget to subscribe to the channel and hit the notification bell. As Officer Hughes leans in, his gaze flickers between Jason's face and the badge on the dashboard. He pauses, momentarily unsure of what he's seeing. Jason, calm but firm, speaks first. "I'm Special Agent Jason Matthews, FBI. Can I help you, officer?" The words are measured, deliberate, carrying a weight that cuts through the stillness of the morning. But Hughes doesn't step back. "License and registration," Hughes says flatly, ignoring the badge entirely. His tone isn't one of courtesy but control. Jason hesitates, his eyes narrowing. He knows exactly what's happening here. Slowly, he reaches into his glove compartment, retrieves the requested documents, and hands them over. His movements are deliberate, calculated to avoid any sudden gestures. He's been in situations like this before, and he knows the stakes. Hughes takes the papers and steps back, his hand still resting near his holstered weapon. He looks over the license but doesn't seem interested in it. Instead, his attention keeps drifting back to Jason. "What are you doing out here?" Hughes asks, his voice carrying an edge. Jason tilts his head slightly, confused by the question. I'm on my way to a meeting downtown, he replies, his tone as calm as ever. But inside, his patience is already beginning to wear thin. The silence that follows feels heavier than it should. Hughes taps Jason's license against his palm, then turns back toward his patrol car without a word. Jason watches him walk away, his jaw tightening. He knows this isn't standard procedure. Not for a traffic stop. Not for a man with an FBI badge in plain view. And yet, here he is, parked on the side of a road for reasons that remain painfully obvious. In the patrol car, Hughes radios for backup. I've got a situation here, he says, his voice low. Driver claims to be federal law enforcement. Sending ID for verification. He doesn't mention the badge Jason showed him. Doesn't mention the steady professionalism in Jason's voice. Instead, he frames it as a potential threat, something that needs to be handled. And the response is immediate. Within minutes, the distant wail of sirens fills the air. Jason hears it and sighs, leaning back in his seat. He watches as 2 additional patrol cars pull up, blocking off the road behind him. Uniformed officers step out, each one scanning the scene with wary eyes. They don't approach Jason's car right away. Instead, they gather near Hughes, exchanging brief words before spreading out to surround the vehicle. Jason grips the steering wheel, his fingers tightening as he glances at the growing cluster of officers. His mind races through the possibilities. He's done nothing wrong. His badge is valid. His record is spotless. But he knows better than to assume that any of that will matter. Not here. Not now. Not with the tension in the air rising by the second. Hughes steps forward again, flanked by 2 of his colleagues. His hand hovers closer to his holster now, his posture rigid. Jason watches him approach, then rolls down the window again, his expression calm but firm. Step out of the vehicle, Hughes orders, his voice sharper than before. Jason hesitates for a moment, then shakes his head. Officer, I've already identified myself. I'm not stepping out unless you provide a lawful reason for this request. The words hang in the air, steady and unyielding. But Hughes isn't interested in explanations. He nods toward one of the other officers, who moves to open Jason's door. Jason instinctively locks it, his heart pounding despite his composed exterior. Don't make this harder than it has to be, Hughes says, leaning closer to the window. Jason meets his gaze and replies evenly, that's exactly what I was about to say to you. For a moment, neither man moves. The standoff is quiet but intense, a battle of wills playing out in silence. Then Hughes steps back and motions to his colleagues. Within seconds, the sound of a baton striking the driver's side window shatters the tense quiet. Glass sprays inward as Jason raises his hands in reflex. The door is yanked open, and hands pull him out of the car with a force that sends him stumbling. The next few minutes are chaos. Jason is cuffed and searched against the hood of his car. He tries to speak, tries to explain, but his words are drowned out by the voices of the officers around him. Stay quiet, one of them barks, pushing him down harder. Jason bites his tongue, his mind racing through his options. But there's nothing he can do now. Nothing that wouldn't escalate the situation further. Hughes watches from a few steps away, his expression unreadable. He holds Jason's badge in his hand, turning it over as if trying to find something wrong with it. Something to justify the scene unfolding before him. When another officer asks what to do next, Hughes simply shrugs. Bring him in, he says, his voice devoid of any emotion. Let's figure it out there. And just like that, Jason is escorted to the back of a squad car, the weight of the handcuffs digging into his wrists. As the car pulls away, Jason stares out the window, his mind racing. He thinks about the badge that should have protected him. About the years of service he's given to a system that now seems to be working against him. He takes a deep breath, trying to steady himself. This isn't over. Not by a long shot. The drive to the station is unnervingly quiet. Jason sits in the back seat, his gaze fixed on the horizon. The hum of the car's engine fills the silence, broken only by the occasional crackle of the police radio. He doesn't speak, and neither does the officer driving. There's a tension in the air, thick and unspoken, as if both men are waiting for something to happen. At the station, Jason is led inside, his wrists still cuffed. The fluorescent lights cast a cold glow over the gray walls, and the faint smell of stale coffee lingers in the air. He's placed in a holding room, small, sterile, with a metal table bolted to the floor. The door closes behind him, the sound of the lock echoing louder than it should. Jason sits down, his shoulders squared, his jaw tight. He knows the drill. He's seen it from the other side too many times to count. But today, he's not the agent in charge. He's the suspect. Outside the room, Officer Hughes stands with his colleagues, the FBI badge in his hand. He holds it up, examining it under the harsh light as if it might somehow reveal itself to be fake. But no matter how hard he looks, the badge doesn't change. One of the younger officers leans in, his voice low. "You sure about this, Hughes? It looks legit to me." Hughes doesn't respond immediately. Instead, he tucks the badge into his pocket and gestures toward the door. "Run his name," he says curtly. "Let's see what comes up." The officer nods and heads toward the computer. Minutes pass. Jason remains seated in the holding room, his eyes fixed on the table in front of him. His thoughts are a whirlwind of anger and disbelief. He knows the power of his badge, the credibility it should carry. And yet, here he is, treated like any other suspect. He clenches his fists, the handcuffs biting into his skin. It's not just the humiliation that stings, it's the principle. The system he's dedicated his life to is failing him in real time. Back at the desk, the officer at the computer looks up suddenly, his expression shifting. "You're gonna want to see this," he says, waving Hughes over. On the screen is Jason's full profile, FBI credentials, years of service, commendations, and an unblemished record. The room falls silent as the weight of the information sinks in. Hughes stares at the screen, his jaw tightening. "Well," the younger officer says hesitantly, "guess we need to let him go." But Hughes doesn't move. His pride and authority are at war with the undeniable facts before him. Hughes finally grabs the radio. "Call their office," he says gruffly, refusing to admit defeat. The officer hesitates, then picks up the phone, dialing the number on file. Jason's supervisor answers on the second ring, his tone brisk and professional. "Agent Matthews is one of ours," he says firmly. "And he better be released immediately." The words leave no room for argument. In the holding room, the door opens suddenly. Jason looks up to see Hughes standing there, his expression unreadable. For a moment, neither man speaks. Then Hughes pulls out the badge, setting it down on the table in front of Jason. "You're free to go," he says, his voice flat. Jason meets his gaze, his eyes hard. "That's it?" he asks. Hughes doesn't respond. Jason stands, his shoulders still squared, his dignity intact despite everything. He walks out of the room without looking back, his badge held firmly in his hand. In the hallway, a younger officer rushes to unlock his cuffs. "Sorry about all this," he mutters awkwardly. Jason doesn't reply. There's nothing to say. As Jason steps out of the station, the cool morning air hits him like a wave. He takes a deep breath, trying to steady the storm of emotions swirling inside him. The humiliation, the anger, the disbelief, they're all still there. But so is the resolve. He knows this isn't the end. It's just the beginning of something bigger. Inside the station, Hughes leans against the wall, his arms crossed tightly. His colleagues exchange uneasy glances, the tension palpable. One of them finally speaks. "You screwed up, man," he says quietly. Hughes doesn't respond. He knows it. They all do. But the admission sits heavy, a weight he's unwilling to confront just yet. Instead, he turns away, retreating into the shadows of the station as the reality of his actions begins to set in. For Jason, the drive away from the station is a blur. His mind is already working, turning over the events of the morning, analyzing every detail. By the time he reaches his office, his determination is clear. This isn't just about him. It's about every man who doesn't have the power of an FBI badge to shield them. Every man who wouldn't have walked out of that station the way he did. He makes a call to his supervisor, recounting the events in precise detail. The supervisor listens carefully, his tone grim. "This isn't the first time we've had issues like this," he admits. "But it's definitely one of the worst. Leave it with me, Matthews. We'll handle it." But Jason knows better. This isn't just about handling it. It's about making sure it doesn't happen again. The revelation hits harder than expected. For Hughes, it's the start of a slow unraveling of his career. For Jason, it's a call to action. And for everyone watching, it's a stark reminder of the biases that can exist in even the most routine interactions. But for those directly involved, the consequences are only just beginning to unfold. The story doesn't stay contained within the walls of the police station for long. It starts as a whisper, spreading through the tight-knit community of Hillsborough. A neighbor overheard the commotion at the side of the road. A police officer mentioned it to his spouse over dinner. By the next morning, the details are making their way onto social media. Posts appear, vague at first, hinting at an incident involving racial profiling. Then the details sharpen. FBI agent wrongfully detained by local police, one post reads, shared hundreds of times within hours. Jason is back in his office when he gets the first call. A local journalist is asking for a statement, their voice edged with curiosity and indignation. He declines to comment, but the phone doesn't stop ringing. By midday, his supervisor is calling him into a meeting. The agency is concerned about optics, about how the incident might reflect on their relationship with local law enforcement. Jason listens silently, his hands clasped in his lap. "We'll issue a statement," the supervisor says. "But we want to tread carefully. This could blow over if we handle it right." Jason doesn't respond. He knows this isn't about handling it. It's about accountability. For Officer Hughes, the fallout comes faster than expected. By the time he returns to his shift the following day, the whispers have reached his department. Fellow officers exchange glances as he walks past, their conversations halting mid-sentence. It's not long before the chief calls him into his office. The door closes with a soft click, but the conversation inside is anything but quiet. "Do you have any idea what kind of storm you've kicked up?" the chief demands, his voice tight with anger. Hughes shifts uncomfortably in his seat, his usual confidence replaced by a quiet defensiveness. "I was following protocol," he argues. The chief's glare hardens. Protocol doesn't cover racial profiling. And it sure as hell doesn't cover ignoring an FBI badge. For the first time, Hughes has no reply. He sits in silence as the chief lays out the next steps, an internal review, possible suspension, mandatory training. The words blur together in his mind, each one chipping away at the foundation of his career. Outside the police department, the public outcry is growing. Local activists organize a rally, their voices amplified by the viral spread of the story. Signs bearing slogans like "End Racial Profiling" and "Justice for All" fill the town square. Speakers take the stage, recounting similar incidents, their words resonating with a crowd that grows larger by the hour. Jason watches the footage on the evening news, his expression unreadable. He's been avoiding the spotlight, but he knows he can't stay silent forever. That evening, he drafts a statement. It's measured, professional, but firm. He acknowledges the gravity of the situation, calling for systemic changes in law enforcement practices. The next morning, his words are printed in the local paper and shared widely online. They spark both support and controversy. Some praise his courage, while others accuse him of overreacting. Jason reads the comments but doesn't engage. His focus remains on the larger picture. Hughes, meanwhile, finds himself increasingly isolated. The internal review uncovers a troubling pattern in his record: complaints about excessive force, allegations of bias, all quietly dismissed over the years. The revelations add fuel to the fire, turning the public's criticism into outright condemnation. Hughes begins to feel the walls closing in. His once solid reputation is crumbling, and with it, his sense of control. In his quieter moments, Hughes begins to reflect, not just on the incident, but on the choices that led him here. He replays the events in his mind, searching for a justification that never comes. The truth is unavoidable. He made assumptions. He acted on bias. And now, he's facing the consequences. As the days turn into weeks, the story takes on a life of its own. National news outlets pick it up, framing it within the broader conversation about race and policing. Experts weigh in, debating the systemic issues at play. Interviews with community leaders highlight the long-standing tensions between law enforcement and marginalized groups. For Jason, the attention is both a burden and an opportunity. He uses it to advocate for meaningful reforms, speaking at town halls and community forums. His voice becomes a rallying point, a symbol of resilience in the face of injustice. But the journey isn't without its challenges. Jason receives anonymous threats, hate mail, and online harassment. He's accused of playing the victim, of exploiting the situation for personal gain. Each accusation cuts deep, but he doesn't let it deter him. He knows the fight is bigger than his own experience. It's about changing a system that has failed too many for too long. By the end of the month, Hughes is suspended without pay pending further investigation. The news sends ripples through the department, dividing his colleagues. Some defend him, arguing that he was just doing his job. Others remain silent, unwilling to align themselves with a man whose actions have brought so much scrutiny. For Hughes, the suspension feels like both a punishment and a relief. It gives him time to think, to process, to confront the reality of what he's done. For Jason, the work continues. He meets with legislators, pushing for policies that address bias in policing. He connects with other victims of racial profiling, sharing stories and strategies for change. Each conversation strengthens his resolve, reminding him of why he chose this path in the first place. And though the road ahead is long, he remains committed to walking it, one step at a time. As the dust begins to settle, the lessons of the incident remain clear. It's not just about one officer or one FBI agent. It's about a system that allows these encounters to happen in the first place. And for everyone involved, the question remains, what will they do to ensure it doesn't happen again? That's the question left hanging over Hillsborough, its police department, and its community. It's a question that lingers for Jason Matthews, Officer Brandon Hughes, and every person who's followed the story. For Jason, the answer is clear: this cannot be another forgotten incident. It's not enough to acknowledge the problem, there must be action, concrete steps to dismantle the biases ingrained in the system. In the weeks following his release, Jason doubles down on his efforts to bring about change. He starts by organizing a series of forums, spaces where the community, local law enforcement, and public officials can come together to address the divide. The first forum is tense, the room charged with unspoken frustrations. But Jason's calm demeanor and measured words set the tone. "We're here to have a conversation," he begins, his voice steady. "Not just about what happened to me, but about what's been happening for years. We need to talk about the system, about training, about accountability. And most importantly, we need to talk about how we rebuild trust." The room is silent for a moment, then a hand goes up. A young man stands, his voice trembling as he recounts his own experience of being racially profiled. His story is followed by another, and another, until the room is filled with voices sharing their pain, their anger, their hope for change. For Hughes, the journey is different. His suspension leaves him with more time than he's had in years, time to think, to question, to reflect. At first, he's defensive, replaying the incident in his mind and finding ways to justify his actions. But as the weeks pass, the defenses start to crack. He begins to see himself in the stories shared at the forums. He recognizes the patterns in his own behavior, patterns he's never had to confront before. The realization is sobering, but it's also a turning point. One evening, Hughes finds himself sitting in his living room, staring at the stack of reports and training manuals he's ignored for years. He picks one up, a mandatory bias training booklet from 5 years ago, still unopened. As he flips through its pages, he begins to understand just how much he's overlooked. The statistics, the case studies, the testimonies, they paint a picture that's impossible to ignore. By the time he finishes, the sun is rising, casting light on a man who feels like a stranger to himself. In the public eye, the story continues to evolve. Media outlets revisit similar cases, highlighting systemic failures and the need for reform. Jason becomes a sought-after speaker, his words carrying weight in a conversation that's long overdue. At a national conference on policing and race, he addresses an audience of law enforcement leaders, community activists, and policymakers. "We can't afford to keep making excuses," he says. "It's not enough to say we're doing our best. We need to do better." His speech earns a standing ovation, but Jason isn't interested in applause. His focus remains on action. Meanwhile, the Hillsborough Police Department begins implementing changes of its own. Mandatory bias training is reinstated, complaints of misconduct are reviewed more rigorously, and officers are encouraged to engage with the community beyond the scope of their duties. The changes are small steps in a long journey, but they represent progress nonetheless. Hughes attends the trainings reluctantly at first, but as the sessions continue, he starts to engage more openly. He asks questions, listens to feedback, and begins to see his role in the larger system. For Jason, the fight isn't just about policies or procedures, it's about changing mindsets. He meets with young people in schools, sharing his story and encouraging them to become agents of change. "You have a voice," he tells them. "Use it. Speak up when you see something wrong. Stand up for what's right." His words resonate deeply, sparking conversations that ripple through classrooms and homes. At one of these meetings, a young woman approaches him afterward. Her brother, she explains, had a similar experience with the police but didn't survive. Tears stream down her face as she thanks Jason for speaking out. He places a hand on her shoulder, his voice quiet but firm. "This isn't just about me," he says. "It's about all of us. And we're going to make sure your brother's story is heard." As the months pass, the story begins to fade from the headlines, but its impact lingers. Hillsborough is no longer the same quiet town it once was. It's a town that's been forced to confront its flaws, to reckon with the uncomfortable truths that many had ignored for too long. For some, the changes are unwelcome. For others, they are long overdue. But for everyone, they are a reminder that progress comes not from complacency, but from the willingness to face hard truths. For Hughes, the journey of self-reflection is ongoing. He attends community forums not as an officer, but as a listener. He begins volunteering with local youth programs, using his experience to mentor young people and rebuild the trust he once took for granted. It's not redemption, he knows that, but it's a step toward accountability. For Jason, the work continues. He knows that the fight for justice is never truly over, that each step forward must be followed by another. But as he stands before a packed auditorium at a community event, he feels a sense of hope. "This isn't about one person or one town," he says. "It's about creating a future where stories like mine don't happen anymore." And that future starts with us. The applause that follows is thunderous, but Jason's mind is already on the next steps. The next conversation. The next opportunity to make a difference. Because for him, the work is more than a mission, it's a promise. And for everyone watching, it's a reminder of what's possible when we refuse to look away. When we confront the biases within ourselves and our institutions. When we commit to building a world that lives up to its promises of justice and equality. It's not easy. It never is. But as this story proves, it's worth it.